written a lot of books on DMT. Spoken about your experiences with DMT and your studies that you've done. Do you want to give me a little intro on why DMT and what brought you towards this molecule?
Yeah, well, I was ultimately or fundamentally interested in the biology of spiritual experience. Um, and I was looking for a naturally occurring compound, one that the body makes on its own, that might be mediating states of consciousness that resemble those that occur when you take a psychedelic drug. and because DMT is um, both a psychedelic drug and naturally occurring in the body, that seemed like a good candidate. Uh, so even though the study that I performed was a basic psychopharmacology study, one of the questions that I brought to bear on the research was whether giving DMT to people would cause uh, changes in consciousness that you would see uh, as a result of meditation or dreams or near death experiences. And if the DMT state resembled those non drug states, then that would support the idea that naturally occurring DMT might play a role in those non drug states. Um, so in a way, it was a search for a spirit molecule or a spiritual molecule, one that the body makes at certain times that um, share features or possess features that people refer to as spiritual.
For those of who don't know what DMT is, what exactly is it? And like you said, it's produced by a body, and like another term for it is endogenous. But what exactly is DMT, and what does it help in, like in the human physiology in general?
hmm well, it stands for dimethyltryptamine, and it's a chemical cousin of serotonin and of melatonin, from the pineal gland. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Um, it's widespread in the natural world. It occurs in hundreds of plants, if not thousands. Um, it is made in the mammalian brain, probably the human brain, but for sure it's made in the rodent brain, and concentrations are quite high. They're comparable to those of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. Uh, so there is the possibility of a DMT neurotransmitter system. Uh, you know, but what regulates the production of DMT in normal physiology isn't yet known. It's got some other properties other than being psychedelic. It seems to promote the growth of neurons from stem cells and also seems to increase the complexity of connections among nerve cells. It also is neuroprotective in conditions of low levels of oxygen in the brain. So this has led people to study its effect in stroke and stroke rehabilitation, and it seems to speed up rehabilitation from stroke and to reduce the size of experimental stroke in experimental animals. So it's quite a utilitarian compound. Concentrations increase in the dying rodent brain, especially in the visual cortex. So in a way that presents a tidy package of a compound that the brain produces during stress, during threats to the integrity of the brain, which are also psychedelic. So if you're dying or you have a bad stroke, let's say, concentrations of DMT increase in order to slow the damage and to speed the healing in the brain. Um, and concentrations increase in the parts of the brain mediating vision. So that may explain some of the visual components of the near-death experience too.
So, with relation to with the book that you written, Joseph Levy Escapes Death. So, this is more almost like a personal account of your experiences with like you getting sick. You were really ill, and then like a account of like you almost like an autobiographical account of everything. Do you want to talk about how that experience changed you and like why you chose to write this book at that time, specific time?
Um, yeah, well, that occurred around 8 years ago. Start well. I completed a book. I finished a book called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. It was a very long project from beginning to end. It was almost 18 years, and I had been thinking about the book, working on it, worrying about it, back and forth with a publisher. Studying the Hebrew Bible over and over and over and over again, to support my hypotheses. So by the time the book was done, I was completely spent. I was just exhausted, and made some foolish decisions. For example, uh, one of my teeth was bothering me, and I went to get a new crown on the tooth, and the crown really didn't fit. It didn't work. It was the wrong material. The tooth got inflamed. I was put on steroids and then flew to visit an internet date that I had met online, and came down with pneumonia, bad pneumonia, because I was immunocompromised as a result of being on those steroids. Um, and I live in a small town in western New Mexico. The healthcare is not very good here, and the healthcare I got was really poor. And I came close to dying in the hospital. Um, and then because of all the antibiotics they put me on, when I came home, I came down with a super bug, with this incredible diarrhea, just unbelievable. Um, so I recovered, from that as well, and then took about 6 or 9 months, to recuperate. And I, told myself if I survived, I was going to write about it because the story was, so extreme. A- And I have a dark, sense of humor. That's one of the things you develop as a medical student and as a physician. Uh, kind of medical humor. It's kind of morbid. And I'm a pretty funny guy in the first place. So I thought I could present the story in a humorous way, and I've also uh, developed introspective abilities over the years from Zen practice and from psychoanalysis, and I thought I could also give a fairly accurate and insightful and almost kind of microscopic, fine-grained account of what was going through my mind at the time. So it was a story. It was a story about being sick, making wrong decisions, friends and not friends, and healthcare and small town life in the U.S. Yeah, so it is autobiographical. Everything that happened to the character happened to me, and everything that went through the character's mind went through my mind. But still, it's a slice of my personality. It isn't just that's not only me. It's just a part which I believe would be entertaining and insightful.
What do you disagree with that person that was like that snapshot in that book? Like how much have you migrated from that person now? Because there is, oh yes, the dark sense of humor that you have, which is unique and is captured within that like that period of stress that you faced.
What's your question? I'm sorry.
So like how do you feel like you've changed since then, or like what has evolved, like what has your life's journey taught you?
Oh, well, I mean, in a way, I'm surprised I survived, and I'm surprised that I felt as good as I did once I finally recovered. It took a long time to feel back to normal. Like, I was over those two acute infections, and month after month after month, I was just dragging myself around. I couldn't hike very strenuously. My energy was really low. Um, yeah, and it just kind of improved one day, and I felt back to normal. Well, it actually was a couple of steps, but they were discrete kinds of steps. It wasn't a gradual thing, as much as like a quantum jump. Um, one of the things was I wasn't thinking very clearly for a number of months, and then one day I started thinking clearly again, and also just my general state of health. I felt weak and poor and vulnerable and fragile. And so that improved, basically overnight, one night as well. Um, well, there were a couple of things that changed. One was that I spent a lot of time uh, studying concentration camp literature, just to see how bad people can feel and be and experience their life. And I also believe that some of my mistreatment at the hospital, or at least it crossed my mind that the bad treatment I received at the hospital was because I was Jewish. And it was a thought I had, and was interested in exploring it. So that got me thinking about anti-Semitism and the resilience of the Jewish people. Um, so it strengthened my faith in God. I did a lot of praying, a lot of looking out the window at the birds, just being glad to be alive. I also started to think that everything that was going to come after this period of illness and recovery was dessert. It was just like an extra frosting on the cake. Um, like it was a gift. It was unnecessary. It was gratuitous life. Um, and I thought I would appreciate things in that way. It strengthened my faith in God. I did a lot of praying, um, lots of studying of text and commentary. Yeah, the anti-Semitism part was interesting. I learned a lot about uh, the bases of anti-Semitism. Um, yeah, so in a way, I became more sober and level-headed. You know, and um, but on the other hand, it was kind of a lighter appreciation, for being alive at the same time.
You spoke about anti-Semitism, and then going back to what the Nazis went did at the concentration camps. You also have spoken about DMT, the spirit molecule, then DMT and the soul of prophecy, where you go back to your religious roots, and you find the connection between DMT and psychedelic experiences, and then the Hebrew Bible. uh, was this at that same time where you found that connection, and then that's where the story evolved, where the book evolved, and your work evolved in that direction?
Yeah. Well, I, you know, uh, the book on DMT and prophetic states. Um, that was completed uh, in 2014, and then as I was relaxing, so to speak, or recovering from all the work of that book, that's when I got sick.
Hmm.
I kind of let my guard down and was kind of reckless. Um, it's interesting. One of the people that I depended on to help me understand, difficult parts of the Bible or difficult parts of the writings of the commentators, was an Orthodox rabbi, modern Orthodox rabbi, who was living in Queens at the time, New York City. He's currently in Israel. And I was out in New York visiting him and his wife at their house. And I explained the work I was doing with comparing the DMT state to the state of the prophetic experience as articulated in the Hebrew Bible. And it's a controversial idea. The concepts that I brought to bear, the tradition. Um, in a way, it's biologically explaining something that for millennia has uh, escaped biological explanations. Um, so in a way, it was kind of dangerous territory because of the potential backlash of saying, "Oh, it's not prophecy, it's not God, it's just your brain on drugs." So uh, the rabbi's wife, brought in pound cake and tea, and looked at me, and she said, "Be very careful with what you're doing. This is pretty dangerous." And I ought to have listened to her more carefully, because after the book was done, I mean, I almost died. So it obviously um, took its toll.
But so, what is the connection between DMT experiences and like religious experiences, like the prophetic experience? So, you explained that in the book, but like, what would you say is very similar about a DMT sort of like trip, if you would say, versus a prophetic experience? Because I know there are similarities, but those of who don't know either one of them,
Mm.
how would you connect those two worlds?
Yeah. Um, well, first of all, it would be helpful if I describe my definition of prophecy. It isn't only foretelling or predicting. It's any spiritual experience that's recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Um, y- y- um, so it can be a full-blown face-to-face communication, let's say between Moses and God, or it could just be inspiration. Let's say David and his sling. It could be a dream which comes true. Um, could be an out-of-body experience. Could be any interaction with spiritual entities like angels. So it isn't only foretelling or predicting, and it isn't only the province of the canonical prophets like Ezekiel or Jeremiah. Almost any spiritual experience. And Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher from the 1200s, um, who I depend on a lot in my ideas, uh, you know, described a 10 or 11 step uh, hierarchy in stages of prophetic experience. So the spiritual platform that I used when thinking about spiritual effects in my DMT work were or was based on my study and practice of Zen Buddhism, which I had been doing for a couple decades before beginning my study. And the peak spiritual experience within Zen Buddhism is enlightenment or Kensho or uh, Satori. Uh, and it's free of content. There is no personality. There's no sense of self left over. There's no awareness of the body. No perceptions. It's basically free of content. Um, and that's the kind of experience I was expecting the volunteers to have, and the volunteers mostly were expecting that kind of experience too, because most of them were meditating within an Eastern tradition at that time. But instead, it was a content. Well, it was an experience full of content. Uh, the personality of the subjects was maintained, maybe even strengthened relative to normal. It was full of things, shapes and images and visions. Um, quite emotional, physical experiences as well. So it was not anything like I expected. And so once the study was over and I had the opportunity to go back to the drawing board, as it were, in developing or in using a spiritual model, to understand the uh, the DMT effect, I started reading the Hebrew Bible. Um, and the experiences in the Hebrew Bible are completely or are entirely interactive and relational, like the ones of my DMT volunteers, as opposed, to unitive, where there's no, differentiation between object and subject. In the prophetic state, it's all interaction. The maintain, there's maintenance of the personality. Time and space, continue to exist. So I started, comparing. Oh, and in the entire Hebrew Bible, all 22 books, there's not one unitive experience. Zero. Uh, so it, seemed to me to be a better model for modeling the DMT experience using a uh, uh, religious or spiritual perspective. Um, so I began comparing quite carefully the phenomenology of the DMT state with the phenomenology of the prophetic state, and that's the majority of the book, the of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. So if you compare the phenomenology, they're strikingly similar. Like all you need to do is open chapter 1 of Ezekiel, and it's completely psychedelic.
Mm.
Ezekiel standing by the river. There's uh, you know, the, well, the heavens open up. There's lightning. There's frozen water. There's ice. There's angels with wings and eyes on their wings, and the roar of rushing waters, and Ezekiel flies through space, and an angel talks to him. It's completely psychedelic. But I dug deeper, because clearly the psychedelic experience has not exerted anything like the prophetic experience on the West, on civilization, on culture. So I began to look, for the differences between the DMT state and the prophetic state. And there were two main differences. One was the interaction effect. The interaction between the volunteer or the participant, or the prophet, and the content of the vision. Um, the interaction between the DMT volunteers and their experiences, wasn't that well formed. It was kind of crude. There was a lot of confusion and not that great communication. It was difficult, for communication to occur, as opposed to the prophetic state, which is quite sophisticated in interacting, with the contents of the spiritual experience. But even more striking was the difference in content, the information content. Um, in the volunteers, the information they brought back was a fine-tuned description of the state itself. It looked this way, it felt this way, it sounded this way. Um, but the information, content, um, what they got out of it was quite meager. It was perhaps psychological, work related, health related, but personal, and not especially uplifting or especially cosmic or philosophical. Um, Much more striking was the complexity of the descriptions of the state. But the content, the information which they gleaned from the state was quite sparse. So it's uh, in a lot of ways, it's the completely opposite condition in the prophetic experience. The content, or um, the visions and the voices in the prophetic experience are only the carriers of information, and it's the information which is much more important, than the nature of the visions. The visions communicate the information, and the prophetic uh, uh, the prophetic message is thousands of years old, is enduring, is extremely influential. The Golden Rule, the One God, civilization is based on biblical ideas, architecture, theology, morality, economics, politics, everything in the West. In a way, relies on information transmitted in the Hebrew Bible. Nobody remembers Ezekiel's, vision, or very few people do. But everybody, knows of the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule, and the ideas of reward and punishment, and God, and things like that. Um, so those were the two main differences. The interaction effect, and clearly, the information differs by uh, uh, many orders of magnitude.
Why do you think there is this difference between, like, this almost being a personable experience, more about, like, the visuals and how they felt, rather than the prophetic communication that was there in the Hebrew text?
Well, I think it is dependent on the source of the endogenous or the increased levels of DMT, and this gets theological. Um, in my study, I was giving people DMT, and it was their brain on drugs, more or less.
Hmm.
Um, in my theories regarding um, the mechanism of the prophetic experience, uh, it's a top down approach, rather than a bottom up approach. The bottom up approach is this is your brain on drugs, and this gives you the impression of communicating with God, or having a spiritual experience. Um, my model is you know is what you could call a top down model. In other words, God is interested in communicating with the prophet, and through God's power or strength, stimulates levels of DMT, which produce visions, which contain information uh, from above. The visions are not random. They're developed, or they're designed to contain and transmit specific divine information. So I think the information content differs, because of the source of the visions. In the case of my volunteers, it was solely their psychology, and in the case of the prophets, it's a combination of this of the individual's psychology, but ultimately the information is originating from a different source, and even though concentrations of DMT in the brain might be comparable, but why they're going up completely differs in their origin.
In the book DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, you also mentioned one subject where he did not see the same, like, prophetic similar experiences. It was almost like the Zen Buddhist experience. What do you make of that?
Yeah, yes. So there was, one of the over 50 volunteers in the DMT study had a unitive experience, the mystical kind of, white light thing. Um, and so he was very interested in that state, and was a religious studies major in college, and belonged to a religious organization, that emphasized, uh, the attainment of that state. So, his experience and the experience of the rest of the volunteers led me to conclude that, DMT is psychedelic as opposed to mysticomimetic or entheogenic or psychotomimetic. It's psychedelic. It's mind manifesting or mind disclosing, which means that people experience what they are primed to experience. So one of our volunteers was a nurse with a long-standing interest in the near-death state, and she volunteered in order to have a near-death experience, and she did. Um, Someone else was a urban shaman, and his big DMT experience um, uh, consisted of shamanic death and rebirth, and it was an experience that that he expected to have at some point in his life, but not then. He expected it to be before he died. He was an old man on a hilltop or something, but instead it occurred, in the hospital on DMT. Um, so people had the experiences that they were primed to have, that they hoped to have. Um, that wasn't always the case because things that people hope for or that motivate them sometimes are unconscious, but still they're quite personal. They belong to them. So even in scary experiences or so-called unexpected experiences, um, they do make sense and are consistent with the notion of psychedelics, clarifying, amplifying, shedding light on things which are already existent in the person's mind, but may be more or less conscious. So in the case of the one volunteer that had that mystical unitive state, um, that's that's the kind of experience that he was hoping for, uh, was prepared for, was building up to through most of his life, and he had that experience.
So I want to go back a little bit to your experience with Zen Buddhism, and then your journey to going back to your, like, religious studies that you were initially like indoctrinated to through your, like, your family and your education system, which you was part of your daily life. And then how did that journey begin, like going back to your roots?
Well, it was a gradual process. I started. Um, so I was born Jewish and raised Jewish. Conservative Judaism. It's kind of the middle of the road with respect to stringency. The Reform is the most liberal. The Orthodox is the most strict. Like the conservative is kind of in between. So that's the stream I was raised in, and I went to Hebrew school 6 hours a week for 8 years as a kid. From 5 to 13 was bar mitzvah. Went to Hebrew speaking sleepover camp outside of LA when I was 13. Um, yeah, so it was part of my life. My friends were Jewish in school, mostly. Um, yeah, but then I was bar mitzvah 13, 14. I became an adolescent. I liked girls. I liked sports, and I stopped thinking about Judaism. Uh, then in college, I started uh, taking drugs, doing drugs, especially psychedelics. And This was the early 1970s, late 1960s on the West Coast, and both psychedelics were in vogue, as were Eastern meditation practices and teachers. And People were describing the effects of meditation in terms that were similar to those used in describing psychedelic experiences. Uh, and I learned to meditate. I started off, learning transcendental meditation when I was maybe 20 or so. Um, yeah, and I,
Was it
wasn't.
when the Beatles started talking about it? Was that your influence, or was it something else?
Well, the Beatles, brought Maharishi, into the West and his technique, transcendental meditation, which I think was in the mid '60s or so. And as a result of the popularity, that the Maharishi gained and his practice gained, Um, Centers just sprung up everywhere in Western Europe and in North America. And I was at Stanford at the time. Kind of a cutting edge place. Yeah, and there was a uh, uh, TM group there, and I learned it was 1972, I think. So it was an okay meditation. It was kind of low key. But I uh, uh, learned to sit still. Their goals, at least when you begin entry into that stream, were kind of modest. Like you could relax more, you'll sleep better, you might be more productive. They kind of draw you in with non-spiritual invitations. If you get more into it, it gets more spiritual. But still, the first layer of things is kind of humdrum. And I wasn't that interested in Hinduism. The Bhagavad Gita just did not draw me in. It just seemed a little too kind of flowery,
Hmm.
um, and faith based. So soon thereafter, I took a course on Indian Buddhism. The original Buddhism of the Buddha. Um, it was one of the earliest undergraduate classes in the country on Buddhism, actually, at the time, and I fell in love with Buddhism. It was like love at first sight. It seemed to me to be a model and a system of thought which articulated the insights or the flashes which I got on psychedelics. In other words, the uh, the relative nature of reality, the underlying core of existence, um, the lofty goals of enlightenment, the peace of mind, the helpfulness, reincarnation appealed to me back then. So in a lot of ways, it was a perfect fit. Um, so I graduated from college, went to medical school, got really depressed. I wasn't ready at all, for the rigors of medical school, especially back in New York City. And I dropped out and ended up at a Zen monastery. Um, I was 22 or so at the time. Yeah, and I was depressed, and I thought all I'm good for is to be a monk. I'll just become cloistered and just mind my own business and just meditate and you know pull nails from boards. That's all I'm good for.
Hmm.
Yeah, but like one day my depression just kind of lifted off my shoulders, and I thought, oh, I feel pretty good. I'm going to go back to medical school, and I did. But I was armed with a meditation practice and a community of monks and uh, um, lay people, that I could rely on and ask for advice and support from. Yeah, and I, did well in school. Moved back to California, started an affiliated meditation group. Helped lead that. Um, you, so I spent a lot of time studying Zen, practicing Zen. I organized a little meditation group at medical school, during lunchtime as well. I was quite devout. I was ordained as a layman. I was married there, all that. So, um, yeah, it was over 20-year involvement with that community. But as I got older, I started to kind of chafe against the bowing. I think my Jewish DNA was starting to rebel against the bowing to statues
Hmm.
and to each other, as opposed to bowing to the Most High, which is God, as opposed to bowing to statues and photographs of dead teachers and each other. Just seemed a bit pagan or idol worshiping or just kind of strange. That was one thing. The organization was becoming increasingly hierarchical, with different colored robes and different titles to different kinds of monks and all that. It was losing the simplicity you know which had originally attracted me. Uh, and I think also in the beginning of my relationship with the community, we were talking a lot about the importance of the psychedelic experience in developing one's interest in Buddhism. I kind of did an informal survey every chance I got, with the monks there, and I asked them if they had taken LSD before they became monks, and pretty much everyone said that was the case. And then I asked them, how important their LSD experiences were in their decision to become a monk. And in pretty much every case, they said, I would not have become a monk if it weren't for my LSD experiences. Because it was an extension of what we were talking about earlier, is that Buddhism, at least ostensibly, uh, provided cognitive framework for understanding and integrating the psychedelic experience. Um, so we were quite comfortable discussing the relationship between Buddhism, Buddhist practice, and the psychedelic experience, for many years. And I shared my hopes of one day performing psychedelic research and articulating and investigating, the relationship between the psychedelic state and and you know, the and the meditative state. But as time went on, and I was closer and closer to doing a study, and once I began the study and began speaking publicly, writing about the relationship between Buddhism and uh, uh, um psychedelics, and in combination with the organization becoming more doctrinaire, more rigidified, more based on loyalty to the teacher and the organization, as opposed to seeking out the truth. uh, we started parting ways around that. They didn't really feel comfortable with me discussing psychedelics and Buddhism in the same breath.
Hmm.
And they were afraid that if I described myself as a student of that organization, it would bring a like a stain to the organization. Yeah, and going back and forth for a couple of years, around that issue, in combination with the fact that I just wasn't that comfortable, or was becoming less comfortable with the structure of the organization as well. And we parted ways. And then in a way that made me feel like I was able to return to my own roots, and began to study the Hebrew Bible, and so on and so forth.
It kind of goes back to that lady who came in with a cake and said, you better be careful with what you're talking about, because you're going to piss a few people off. There's been a difference in the way people accept, speaking about DMT and its experiences, over, like, when you were talking about it with the Buddhist monks. How much has it changed? Because, like, when you did start your studies, getting the approvals to legally do this in a scientific method, there was not, like, it was not just like, go in, get it approved, and like get the funding. What was that experience like, and how did you manage to do something which was completely like unthought of at that time?
Well, I just persisted. I spent a lot of time in being adequately trained, in the case that at some point in the future it was going to be uh, possible to study psychedelics again. Um, it was when I was 20 that I decided I really want to do psychedelic drug research. But this was 1972. These compounds were all put into Schedule One, the most restrictive legal category. Um, only uh, a couple of years before that, and when I applied to medical school, 1972, I told everybody that I wanted to be a doctor so I could study psychedelics, and I applied to 21 schools and was rejected by 19 because like I was a smart kid,
Mhm.
research, Stanford, all that. But once I started explaining my motivations for becoming a doctor, they just said, "This is crazy. You can't do it."
Yeah.
Yeah, so the two schools I got into, I think one of them felt sorry for me, and the other, it was a very brief interview, and they never gave me the opportunity to start talking about psychedelics. Um, so I stopped, publicly or with friends or with, my teachers describing my long-term interest, but still, I knew if there were ever going to be the opportunity to study psychedelics, it would be, uh, scientifically, and I needed to get the best possible training. So I went to medical school. When I was thinking about what specialty to choose, I chose psychiatry. One of the reasons, being if there were ever to be, uh, research occurring again, it would most likely occur within psychiatry. So I, trained in psychiatry. I was interested in the pineal gland as an undergraduate, even, and was thinking it was potentially a spiritual organ, or it might produce a compound that had spiritual effects or psychedelic effects. And I was always interested in the pineal as a potential like a spiritual organ. And my first job out of psychiatric uh, training was in Alaska, and it was around that time that psychiatry was beginning to describe the syndrome of winter depression. And winter depression was believed to be a result of abnormal function of the pineal gland. And I thought, oh, this could be my opportunity, to get into research studying the pineal gland. And I went back to school, uh, took some extra training in, clinicals, in, uh, clinical psychopharmacology research. And, and I learned how to do, clinical research, giving drugs, uh, I'm administering questionnaires, drawing blood samples, and the like. Um, reading literature, critically. Yeah, and so I completed, that extra training. Moved out to the University of New Mexico, where there was very strong support for doing research. And I found a mentor there that was very interested in melatonin, not because of its potential psychedelic effects, but because of its endocrine effects, puberty, reproduction, those kinds of things. You, uh, so I completed an exhaustive study of melatonin, and we determined it was not psychedelic, only sedating. There wasn't very much known about melatonin in humans at the time. This was the early or the the mid 1980s. So we determined it was sedating, as opposed to psychedelic. And in the meantime, I had learned about DMT. It's naturally occurring. It had been studied before. It was quite psychedelic, uh, short acting, obscure. Um, so I, switched, careers as it were. I stopped the melatonin work and, pivoted to the DMT work. And, wrote a protocol in September of 1988, gave our first, dose of DMT in November 1990. It was over 2 years. And, you know, I
No,
just
that's
stuck.
fine.
I figured if they didn't, tell me no, that meant maybe. And so I was just on the phone, uh, sending faxes. That was back in the day of faxes. There wasn't much in the way of email. Um, yeah, so I just would not give up. And finally, I found sympathetic ears in both the FDA and the DEA. Which were um, uh, um, the federal agencies responsible, for both the clinical safety part of things and the regulatory, security diversion concerns. Yeah, it was also extremely difficult, to find someone to make the DMT. Uh, yeah, it was interesting. I received two grants before even giving us a single dose of DMT. So people were extremely interested in the study succeeding, because there hadn't been anyone with good you know uh, scientific credentials applying to, to do a basic study of psychedelics in humans. We were careful to avoid anything controversial. Um, so we only studied normal volunteers, only those with experience with uh, uh, um, um, with um, with psychedelics in the first place. We weren't interested in doing therapy. Uh, we weren't interested in inducing spiritual experience. It was just a straightforward psychopharmacology study. You give various doses and you measure a number of variables. We were looking mostly at biological variables, specifically the endocrine effects, because you know back then, um, people were looking at the effects of drugs on receptors in the brain indirectly through the stimulatory effect of those drugs on specific hormone levels like uh, cortisol, prolactin, endorphin, those kinds of things. Um, we were also looking at other biological variables like core temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, those kinds of things. We also developed a new questionnaire to quantify the subjective effects. And that was another example of the importance of Buddhism, to me at that time, because we developed that questionnaire, based on Abhidharma principles, uh, which is the school of Buddhist psychology. Um, Buddhism, uh, divides ongoing mental experience into five categories. And we use those categories, to uh, develop questions to uh, uh, to comprise a questionnaire, and we could score the DMT responses with respect to somatic effects, perceptual effects, cognitive effects, volitional effects, those kinds of things. Um, so it was a basic psychopharmacology uh, protocol. Give small, medium, and high doses, and measure as many variables as you can.
You have mentioned in the past about, like, there's a specific reason why you chose DMT over anything else, because it's something that the body produces by itself. Then also a DMT trip doesn't last that long, so it was easier for you to analyze the data and, like, get that information over anything else. Was how I One part of me just is really curious about how the conversation went with the government bodies for them to, like, approve this, because I know it was a very scientific approach and method, but then that was the time where it was this huge war on drugs, and there was a complete no, because this is just bad for you, and they shut it down. So to be able to do that in such a manner, how was that? What was that conversation like?
Um, well, it was a case of just walking into the lion's den, as it were. Um, kind of jujitsu. Yeah, like at first was interested in studying, DMT because it was a very cool drug. It was amazing. It was visual. It was completely psychedelic. It was mind blowing. All those things. But that would not fly with war on drugs. And so instead, I said, DMT is a dangerous drug, and we ought to understand what it's doing. So I got funded by the war on drugs, but it was the same study. Uh,
Hmm.
Give experienced, uh, psychedelic users, various doses of DMT, and see what happens. Um, a- well, at the same time, I wouldn't say it backfired, that approach, but it kind of limited me to the psychopharmacology, and the and the so-called pathological effects of psychedelics. And I was hoping to accumulate a team around me in New Mexico, to branch out from the I, I, purely pharmacological approach. um, uh, doing therapy, looking at other drugs, spiritual effects, creativity, those kinds of things. But I couldn't. It was just, our studies were just, too far ahead of the curve, and nobody really knew what we were doing out here, and they weren't, prepared to make a move and change their careers and all that. And um, so as a result, the studies were becoming increasingly pharmacological, and were taking me away from my primary interest, which was to use these compounds for the for good, as opposed to just kind of understanding their brain chemistry. And once that became clear, I thought, well, I've done my part for the movement, and it's time to move on.
Hmm. Uh, I want to go back a little bit about the pineal gland and the historical relevance of it. So there is historical text, even like, the Egyptians spoke about, like, the power of the pineal gland and how it's like almost the source of your consciousness. Is that somehow connected to DMT like experiences or like prophecies or like your body producing DMT and then coming to that state of consciousness?
Yeah, well, the pineal gland is a very interesting story. Yeah, like as you mentioned, it has a long history in esoteric, spiritual physiology. It's the location anatomically, anyway, of the experience of the highest of the chakras, the highest of the Kabbalistic, Sephirot, as well, the spiritual channels. Um, yeah, and Descartes, believed it, was the conduit for thoughts to be downloaded from God to the human mind, and that the pineal secreted thought somehow into the cerebral spinal fluid. Yeah, it was a very interesting organ, has a long history of speculation about its function, spiritually. Um, and in my well, a few years before publishing the first uh, book on DMT, the spirit molecule, I reviewed all of the relevant pineal physiology literature, and decided or concluded that it was feasible to suggest that the pineal gland makes either DMT or some other closely related psychoactive compounds in addition to melatonin. And I include that speculation in my DMT book as one of the last chapters. And as a result, that's spurred on a pineal investigator at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Jimo Borjigan, a Mongolian researcher, um, who quite sophisticated pineal researcher. Um, So she started, to look, for DMT in the pineal as a result of those speculations, which I you know, uh, uh, was describing. Um, so she, found, DMT in the fluid around the pineal gland of rodents. This was a paper that came out in 2013 or 2016. I can't remember. Um, so that confirmed, my, thinking about the pineal as potentially, producing DMT. But on the other hand, people seem to live normal lives without pineal glands. They dream normally. They aren't inhibited spiritually. The main thing is because of the reduced amount of melatonin, they aren't able to accommodate jet lag wise if they are crossing a lot of time zones. That's seems to be the main problem in people without pineal glands. Pineal glands are um, sometimes destroyed by a stroke, let's say, or there can be pineal uh, tumors that need to be removed surgically. And it seems as if people without pineal glands, uh, they live relatively normal lives. So even if the pineal, we're making DMT, it seemed as if it wasn't making DMT all the time. Otherwise, without a pineal gland, uh, people would be more strongly affected somehow or another. And a few years later, the same group in Michigan was um, looking for DMT in the brain, rather than the pineal gland. And in their study that came out in 2019, even though the ingredients for DMT production were quite high in the pineal, and the required enzymes to combine the ingredients into DMT were quite high in the pineal, that it seemed as if it was uh, concentrations in the brain were quite high, and there didn't seem to be DMT in the pineal. And they concluded that from their first study, the the DMT that they described in the pineal was actually from the brain. Would they kind of uh, stick a probe into the brain, but or into the pineal, through the brain, in and out, and you know the uh, DMT, which they described at first from being in uh, uh, the pineal, was instead brain DMT. So people were kind of saying, "Oh, that proves the pineal doesn't make DMT and blah blah," but I think even more important than the pineal making or not making DMT is that the brain does, and those are quite high concentrations in everyday life in the rodent anyway, and they increase at the time of death. Um, the group in Ann Arbor still believes the pineal may make DMT, but only under uh, certain conditions. In the meantime, though, the main source appears to be the brain.
So, I mean, is there any study that is there with, like, some way like depriving the body of DMT and what that would look like? Would that be completely removing consciousness out of a human?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, clearly. And especially if there's a DMT neurotransmitter system there kind of, regulating our sense of reality. Um, yeah, back in the day, when it was first discovered that humans contained, DMT, the emphasis was on psychosis. The belief was that perhaps schizophrenics make, too much DMT, and if we can block DMT with drugs, that would be an effective antipsychotic treatment. Um, and so that thinking was based on the descriptions of overlap between the symptoms of an LSD state and the symptoms of psychosis. There was overlap. And once there was a discovery of DMT, they said, "Oh, this is the brain's own LSD, and if we can use the if we can develop antidotes to LSD, maybe we could develop antidotes, to overproduction of DMT in people with psychosis." Uh, they were also interested in uh, developing antibodies, to DMT, like a DMT vaccination, as it were.
What a
Uh,
nightmare.
yeah, wouldn't that be something? Yeah, so those never panned out. DMT. Uh, Research kind of ended before the studies could really get down to business. It is still a theory which is um, of interest to European groups, primarily the psychotomimetic theory. Like if you could blockade psychedelics, would it blockade the symptoms of psychosis? It isn't an area of research in the U.S. that much. Um, so there is a specific enzyme which is required for the production uh, of DMT. It's called N-methyltransferase, and you can what's called knock out that gene. You can silence it. So the animal no longer is um, you making the enzyme, which everybody over decades has believed is required for the last step in synthesis of DMT. So the group in Ann Arbor is still uh, um, I'm at the forefront of this kind of research, and they've developed a knockout. Uh, you know, uh, 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 um, well, so they've developed mice or I think rats. I can't remember which, but that don't produce that enzyme. The gene's been silenced. So uh, they're studying these animals, which theoretically are not making DMT, and mostly they seem normal. Uh, so either there's another way for the brain to make uh, DMT that doesn't require that enzyme, or DMT isn't required for normal life. Um, it's extremely interesting that there isn't more research on endogenous DMT. It's this incredibly powerful psychedelic. It's made in the brain in high concentrations. What's it doing there? And there's like two people in the world that I know of that are studying endogenous DMT. One's a graduate student and one's a postdoc, and that's pretty much it. So
So the
there's
hands of human consciousness are left to two people in the whole entire world.
you could put it that way. Yeah,
Sad state of affairs.
it is.
Uh, I want to go deviate a little bit towards like going back to religion and then also psychedelics, not specifically to DMT. So John Marco Allegro wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and he talks about how uh, religion by itself, by its like it's psychedelic rituals and experience with like fertility rituals. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe like is that slightly related? Because this is Christianity, not specifically Jewish traditions.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we need to keep in mind that these compounds are psychedelic. They
Hmm.
just are tools. They just magnify and make more meaningful things which are pre-existent in the mind.
Yeah.
So you could say that early Christians took psychedelic mushrooms, or they took like LSD like containing drinks, but that was not the source of their beliefs. It simply magnified, made more true, made more meaningful and convincingly real things that they were kind of thinking about or weren't sure about. They were wanting more clarity regarding certain ideas. So if you're an early Christian and you're not sure about your faith, then you take a psychedelic, drug. It'll firm up your faith, or it could anyway. Um, so I don't think that these compounds produced Christianity or any religion, but it just increased the fervor and the belief and the conviction of the truth of the path that they were on.
There, I can't remember the name for this life of me, but I remember someone speaking about how psychedelic mushrooms was the reason why the human brain evolved to like consciousness, and then we are who we are, or like from apes to humans.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the stoned ape theory of Terence McKenna.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, the stoned ape. Yeah, it's a cool idea. There isn't much evidence, but still, it's a good working. It's a good working hypothesis. Um, yeah, well, so he believed that monkeys anyway, or apes, discovered psilocybin containing mushrooms, and they ate them, and you know they were they were able to see sounds, which is a common occurrence with psychedelics. uh, so they would speak, or they would utter uh, uh, sounds, and um, would see them. So that added a layer of ability to manipulate sounds in a way to enhance communication, and theoretically stimulated the development of language. Uh, and he also referred to some early studies of psilocybin, indicating that it improved certain uh, certain visual properties, being able to perceive things visually, from a distance, or figure ground relationships became uh, more striking. uh, so those were clearly those were adaptive pharmacological effects. Psilocybin also, like we were talking about earlier, stimulates the growth of new neurons, stimulates the complexity of uh, connections among neurons, and you, those new connections and those new nerve cells don't develop randomly. They develop in a particular environment, uh, and so if if you're an ape and you're hunting, let's say, or you're speaking, or you're starting to learn, uh, language, then the growth of the brain would be directed, as it were, as a result of those activities that you're involved in. Um, so that would be like an interplay uh, among the drug and the brain and your environment, which theoretically could direct human evolution.
Do you feel like maybe a part of us are like, we've left this massive gap because this war on drugs to like, evolve to like a higher level of humans in general, like as a species? Because we've created this gap because of this war on drugs. And like, I know the narrative is slightly changing, but it's going to take a really long time to come back to where, that's something that we use as a tool and on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I think it just depends on uh, how they're used, and who uses them, and uh, for what purposes? I mean, you could use, psychedelics, for terrible things, uh, brainwashing, neo Nazis, Charles Manson. You can, you know, become more dedicated, more zealous with respect to, crazy, violent ideas as well. Um, there's, a lot of interest in how, psychedelics make you more compassionate, more open, more accepting. But that's not necessarily good in and of itself because you might be more open to crazy, violent ideas as opposed to, loving, compassionate ideas. And compassion isn't always a good idea either. I mean, you don't want to be, compassionate to, somebody who's trying to kill you. So I think you need to be discriminating and just think about these compounds as tools. They're kind of neutral tools. So I think in the right hands, used in the right way, that psychedelics can be useful for treating mental illness, for improving the quality of life in people without mental illness, wellness, meditation, creativity, but it isn't fait accompli. It isn't an established fact. I mean, you just you can't put too much credit to the drugs themselves. That's why it's just as important to pay attention to your own development first and the environment in which you're going to be uh, taking the drugs and for what purpose as much as the drugs themselves.
I You touched upon a little bit on the negative uses of psychedelics and, like, whose hands it is on. Do you want to speak about the LSD experiments that the US government did during the, I think it was the 70s, where they used it almost like a tool, where they were put in brothels with, like, people in the government, and then try to do experiments on it, and how that didn't pan out in the best way?
Yeah, yeah. So there were a couple of studies. Y- yeah, they I think were mostly under the umbrella of a study or uh, of a project which was called MK Ultra, and it was fairly wide ranging. Yeah, they would dose people unsuspectingly. There was a house of prostitution in the Bay Area, where the prostitutes were under the employ of the CIA, and they gave their clients LSD, and they were filmed and all that. So there was also interest in brainwashing people with LSD, to make them into killers.
Hmm.
uh, there were also some studies with the army, with the armed services, to see if these could be, weapons of mass destruction, so to speak, non-lethal but incapacitating, uh, bio warfare or chemical warfare tools. So those never really panned out, because the effects of psychedelics are unpredictable, and they're dependent on the set, the person, and the setting, the environment. So you couldn't turn somebody without violent tendencies into a trained assassin. They just weren't uh, capable of it. You could scare them, you could confuse them, you can make them believe certain things, but you couldn't fundamentally change their character, because they're psychedelic drugs. They're mind manifesting, mind disclosing. They're not killer drugs. They're not brainwashing tools. Um, so uh, that that kind of trained assassin uh, model um, never really worked out. The prostitution, giving LSD surreptitiously, that was just kind of a big mess. I mean, people would freak out. They might not, um, well, I think the goal of that prostitution study or protocol was to see if people would um, divulge secrets that they wouldn't otherwise when they were under the influence of LSD. And sometimes they did, but sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they became suicidal or got depressed or ran out of the building. So it was just too unpredictable. The the chemical warfare approach didn't really work out that well either, because of dispersal problems like the wind and the hills and things like that. And people could be inspired by these drugs, or they could start crying under the drugs, or they would become more fierce with the drugs. So it was the unpredictability in all of those circumstances, which led to, in a lot of ways, the abandonment of that protocol. There were some suicides as well, and you had to pay attention to them.
Was that before or during the same time where the war on drugs started? Because on the same parallel vein, there was this thing that people were tuning out. They were using, like, psychedelic drugs, not going to war, not going conforming with what the government wanted to indoctrinate. And is that like slightly, like, played a big part in government system going like, what, let's just completely put this as a Schedule 1 drug?
Yeah, well, the war on drugs kind of began uh, with Richard Nixon in the late '60s, which coincided with Tim Leary and the anti-war movement and all that. Um, so that inspired Nixon to declare a war on drugs. But at the same time, those CIA studies were taking place. I well, anytime a new technology comes out, especially a disruptive one, you try to weaponize it, and you know. People were taking LSD and being rebellious, and the government said, "Oh, that this is a disruptive agent. Maybe we could turn it to our advantage, somehow or another." Um, so I think those two movements, or those two approaches, were kind of happening in parallel.
I want to go back a little bit on, like, where you said that doing DMT or any psychedelic drug is not for everyone. Do you feel like the next approach to, like, legalization would be alongside a pathway where, there are tools, there are systems in place which can help? Because I know getting the government involved with what you just said right now doesn't make sense. But then how would that look like a future where it is a part of like, our group, like our understanding of humans and how we live our lives in societies where psychedelics are part of it, and yet it's not controlled by government?
Well, I think it needs to be at least observed by the government and kind of regulated. Y- y- uh, you don't want a 2-year-old to crawl into psilocybin dispensary and say, I want to take mushrooms. Yeah, there need to be uh, some guardrails. But still, it is complicated because psychedelics can be used in any number of settings. Like the medical setting. If you're an addict, if you're depressed, if you got OCD, if you're about to die, and you're despairing, that's the medical model. And and you would need to be very well trained, and there would need to be a lot of medical support around at the time. So the government would be more involved in that kind of setting. Um, and on uh, and on The other end of the spectrum would be you just want to take a psychedelic and take a walk in the woods, either by yourself or with some friends. And how do you do that without uh, without fear of legal prosecution? Uh, so um, yeah, it's a tough scenario. There's religious use. There's shamanic use. There's wellness retreats going on in Jamaica using psilocybin, DMT. You know, um, there are underground clinics which are operating in kind of a gray zone using ibogaine and ayahuasca to treat any number of things or to just improve your wellness. So I wouldn't want to see things become a complete free for all. Otherwise uh, there's bound to be a recurrence of the frequent adverse effects which led to problems in the first place. Suicides and you know uh, violence, psychosis, emergency room visits, inpatient hospitalizations, panic attacks, flashbacks, all those things which alarmed the government and resulted in the public health approach to this is an epidemic of a drug that we don't understand. We just have to make them illegal, and then we could figure out what to do later. And I think if it's just completely like anybody can take whatever they want anytime in any setting, there are going to be a lot of adverse effects. There's going to be backlash, and there's going to be more regulation. I suppose it should be a stepwise kind of process. Like medical, and then perhaps psychological, and then perhaps ceremonial, religious, and then recreational. I think we don't want to put the proverbial cart before the horse. I think just making everything legal, I think is just is going to cause some problems.
What would be your, like, PSA to anyone who is thinking of doing DMT? Because there are some people who should not touch it, like with a 10-foot pole, and not everybody talks about that when they're trying to talk about legalization. The same thing goes with, like, standard issue weed, where it's like everyone should do weed. It's going to be like, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 12-year-olds are starting to do weed, when it has massive ramifications when your brain is developing. So what would you say to someone who's like, just like dipping their toes?
Well, I think that the most important thing is to be educated. To educate uh, yourself about psychedelics. What are they? What do they do? What don't they do? What are they good for? What are they bad for? How do you prepare? Medically, psychologically, spiritually. What medications should you not be on if you're thinking about taking a psychedelic, including DMT. Um, yeah. Are you going to, you know, um, what compound do you want to take? Is it going to be LSD, which is 12 hours, or DMT, which is just a half hour and you smoke it? Is it going to be psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine? What are you going to take and why? What kind of dose? Is it going to be by yourself or with one friend or in a group? If it's with a group, what kind of group is it? Is there a leader? All that. So yeah. Public service announcement. Know what you're getting into. Take precautions. Don't be reckless. In my new book, this on the psychedelic handbook, the longest of the chapters is called "How to Trip," and it is kind of a step by step guidelines for how to make the most of your experiences and how to minimize potential risks.
And if there was someone who's like the young Rick Strassman, who's just like, enthusiastic about it, but wants to move the needle forward into, the path of psychedelics, even specifically DMT, what would you recommend? Like saying in today's day and age, and they want to like, because you said there are only two people who are studying it, and there's more research that's required. So what would they do? What path would you let them take?
Well, you need to get trained. If you want to make an impact, if you want to do impactful research, to move the needle, you need to have sterling qualifications. Um, if you want to study animals or brain physiology, solely, you could specialize, get your doctorate in neuroscience. If you want to, work with humans, clinical psychology and psychological research, or psychiatry, like I did. Um, yeah, yeah. You would need to be well-rounded too if you want to make the greatest impact. I mean, you can't. I think advance the field if you're a zealot. If you're a zealot, it becomes like a religion.
Hmm.
You want to remain open-minded. Um, so you need to work on yourself as well as just your training. So you want to you know uh, have your own psychotherapy, understand yourself, what makes you the way you are, what are your motivations, what are your relationships like. You want to understand spirituality at a personal level, like you would want to be involved with some religion in a serious manner, community, scriptural, uh, tradition, uh, relationship with a teacher. Um, I think it probably is a good idea to have your own, psychedelic experiences. Although I don't think it's necessary. I don't think those are as important as just working on yourself in other ways. Because a lot of people who take psychedelics without working on themselves, they just become convinced that they're right. And they become kind of dogmatic about things without understanding themselves any better. So if you had to choose among spiritual practice, psychotherapy practice, and having your own experiences with these drugs, I think the one which is which is dispensable would be having your own experiences. Those aren't really necessary. If it's in the context that you're working on yourself, then for sure. But otherwise, I don't think you know uh, I don't think simply having your own experiences, that doesn't make you an expert, or somebody that other people want to listen to automatically.
What is the meaning of it all? Like you've like searched for religion, you've gone to Buddhist, Zen Buddhism, and then like just introspection through psychedelics, through other tools. What through all your years of research have you found the meaning of what our purpose is?
Well, oh gosh, I think we ought to do what we can to promote world peace. Anything we can do to promote world peace, I think that's our task.
And what where can people find you? Like I know your books are available, and there it's almost literally the Bible for psychedelics, although it's kind of connected to the Jewish Bible.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's a quasi Bible. Well, you can reach me through my website, rickstrassman.com, and I have a couple of pages on Facebook, and I do answer almost every email. Like occasionally, if it's a really out there email, I won't because I want to engage. But that might happen once or twice a year. Otherwise, I respond to every email.
And where
And
can people follow
I
your work?
Yeah, and you could buy my books through my website, in which case I will sign the books and inscribe them. Um, yeah, if uh, any new podcasts or interviews or articles which uh, come out on my post uh, on rickstrassman.com and Facebook. I don't have Twitter or Instagram at this point. I'm only one man. I don't have a team or a secretary or anything. So I'm kind of limited, social media wise. Yeah, but still, I have a website and I'm on Facebook.
You're accessible.
Yeah, yeah, I most definitely am accessible.
Are you working on anything that we need to look out for? Like, when you went into like religious studies with DMT, are you some working on something that's on the edge where people should just be like, okay, look out for that?
Well, I have uh, uh, a couple of writing projects. Um, One is a bit of a strange one. It's a translation and commentary on the book of Genesis. I just love the Hebrew Bible and I love the Hebrew language. And I love the commentaries which have been written in the Middle Ages. Like I ought to have been born in the Middle Ages. Uh, it's about 1,200 pages right now, and I'm only
Oh
about
gosh.
like 80% through Genesis. I'm on chapter 46 out of 50. So one day I will finish that. It isn't around the corner though, that's for sure. I'm working on another shorter term uh, writing project. It's tentatively titled Altered States. Um, and it's um, compilation of narratives of my own experiences with altered states. Uh, uh, you know, uh, you know, uh, Primarily psychedelics. But ones which developed as a result of meditation or stress or uh, childhood trauma. Those kinds of things. Um, yeah, I've got a few hundred pages of journal notes that I've been keeping ever since I was in my late teen years, early 20s, and I'm starting to polish those up. I'm including a commentary as well. It isn't just amazing dope tales. It's amazing dope tales in combination with some perspective. Like okay, this happened because of that, and maybe it means uh, this. Like for example, I have one chapter in there. I was interested in a woman, who was in an abusive relationship. We took MDMA together, and it just did not work out. She took too much, became delirious, and I was completely delusional. Like MDMA would make us fall in love with each other. So I describe that trip in excruciating detail, and I also include like the pharmacology. What happens if you take too much MDMA, and what can and what kind of crazy ideas might you enter into psychedelic experience with somebody else. What are your hopes and your fears and potential outcomes in uh, those regards. Like after that experience, I like a couple of days later, I called around, found a psychoanalyst and said, I need help. And I started
Okay.
psychoanalytic treatment, which, lasted 4 years, so um, it, it will be a, yeah, it'll be a combination of experiences and, my understanding of them, their consequences, their etiology, those kinds of things.
And when would that come out? Because the book on Genesis is going to take a while.
It's going to take a while. Yeah. Well, I'm starting to shop around for publishers, for the Altered States book. I've got, a couple of, people looking at it now. So, uh, I think, Uh, once I begin working on it, it shouldn't take that long. Maybe a year. Um, I'm gonna be uh, taking a break from stuff starting November. Just gonna stop doing interviews. You know, uh, uh, stop giving lectures. For a couple of months, and even if I, sign on a contract to work on altered states, I wouldn't begin working on it until sometime next year.
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking to me at least.
Well, thanks. It's fun.